a little bit about yourself.
Want me to go first?
You go first.
Okay. Well, my name's Andrew Dasinger, and I grew up here in Niantic, Connecticut. Um, and this is where I first became engaged in enjoying nature and bird watching. So it's good to be back here.
Yeah.
So that was back. We moved here in 1969. So I was about let me see, 6 years old, I guess, right?
You started first grade here. I think you were kindergarten.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. I mean, I've been a bird watcher all my life since being here. So, and remained engaged in birding and conservation and lots of that stuff.
I'm Bruce Dasinger, and I've been around a while, obviously. And I grew up in the panhandle of Florida in a rural area and was in the woods practically all the time that I was out of school, barefoot most of the time. And became interested in birds generally because they moved and had color. I got more interested in birds when I went into the Okefenokee swamp in Georgia. I wasn't birding actively then, but I was introduced to a bird guide, which led me into it. I didn't actively bird until I came to Connecticut, moved into the house we are presently in, adjacent in Oswegatchie Hill, 50 years ago in 1969. That's when we moved here. So this happened to be in our backyard. So it was very advantageous to the start of it. So that's where I actively started it. My first activity was a Christmas count, an Audubon Christmas count. I didn't know such a thing existed, and that's when I really got hooked. Then,
and so you hooked me too, right? Because he was doing this. He took us out in the woods a lot here. And I think my first experience bird watching was to go on a field trip to the Delmarva Peninsula.
Yeah.
And I got to miss a day of school. So this was like, oh yeah, I'm all in on this. I didn't really know much about bird watching per se, but I thought it'd be a great experience. And from that point on, I was pretty much hooked on bird watching and birds, and it just grew from there.
And so I actively bird watched. I look at birds all the time, backyard birds plus the birds here, and been on a lot of bird trips, Central America and South America, and all over the country except a few states. And so it's been a very interesting ride, very engrossing. I think I'm interested in birds for a lot of reasons. I grew up with birds and I like nature. Plus, I'm a microbiologist and I'm used to looking at things carefully under the microscope. That attracted me to birds because bird watching and bird study is a lot of identification, looking at small details in birds. As Roger Torrey Peterson, who lived in Old Lyman, wrote many birding guides and was a bird artist, said he identified birds by a process known as field marks. So in his bird guides, he points arrows to certain points that one should look for, certain details. So that appealed to me as a science background and microbiologist. So that hooked me a little bit too, and one of the reasons for my interest. Plus, I'm musically inclined to some extent, and bird song interested me musically. So those two things fit right in with what I was interested in.
What's your favorite memory birding?
Wow, there's a lot of different memories I have here, but when I think back to being in the hills here in the Oswegatchie Hills, I spent countless hours back there after school, before school, during the summer, just exploring and learning things on my own, kind of self-teaching myself. So, some of the birds that I saw back there are pretty memorable. For instance, if I found a nest of a bird, that was pretty exciting at that time. So I remember very well finding a worm-eating warbler nest one year. Never found something like that before. It was pretty exciting. Seeing a baby great horned owl, You know, you'd always run across something new, and that's the exciting part. Is always finding something new to see.
So if you find a nest, does that mean it's not a migratory bird?
So nesting species, yeah, that means they're resident here. That means they've set up a breeding territory. So there's a male and a female. The male gets here first usually and starts to sing to announce its territory and to attract a mate potentially. They form a pair bond and they begin to build a nest and lay the eggs. They incubate the eggs for, on the order of 20 days, 30 days. Eggs hatch, babies, they feed the babies for another 20 days in the nest, and then they fledge. Might stay with the parents for a little while longer, and that's the kind of the whole process that happens here.
If you looked at if the birds that are here, most of the birds would be migratory as far as numbers of birds, right, Andrew? Would you think that to be true? Like the warblers are all migratory.
Yeah, there's some that nest here, there's some that pass through, but all the warblers that do nest here ultimately migrate to Central America, South America. They actually spend more of their time away from here than they do spend here. They might be here for 3 months, they spend the rest of the time down in the tropics.
Birds like scarlet tanager migrate, ovenbird migrates, flycatchers migrate. The resident birds would be blue jays, what else would be resident?
Chickadees, nuthatches, different woodpeckers. There's a whole set of birds that stick around all year. And then we get other birds that come here for the winter. So they nest farther north and they migrate south. And this is one of their places where they might stay for the winter. So birds are changing throughout the year, yeah.
Bruce, do you have a favorite memory of birding with the family in the early years?
Well, birding with Andrew, well, I think the Delmarva trip that he mentioned in the beginning is a memorable trip because everything was new to them and a lot of things were new to me because this was early on for me also. I joined a birding group around here, and as a group from the southeast Connecticut, a New London County area, we would team up in cars and drive all the way down to Delmarva in Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia, and cover the shore area and the land area and see many new species. And as far as birding with Andrew goes, overall in Central America, we took a trip together once to Costa Rica and birded for 10 or so days, and seeing a resplendent quetzal for the first time was very memorable.
Yeah.
And that's magnificent. Is it resplendent quetzal?
Resplendent quetzal, yes.
It's a long-tailed bird, very tropical looking, very colored looking. As far as memorable birds generally in the U.S., painted bunting. I like color. Painted bunting, which is a pure green, red, blue. Is that right? Color, small bird. On the shores of North Carolina, near Wrightsville, North Carolina. And so, Wrightsville Beach, in fact. I just remember those flitting in and out of the dunes. I don't forget that. So, those are the main ones.
So when you're starting out, of course, you usually have a field guide and you look at the field guide, you look for different field marks and you try to match that to the bird you see. But as you use one of these. But as you gain experience, it becomes much more of an automatic process in terms of identifying birds. So you listen for sound, you look at the plumage details, you look at the behavior, flight pattern, the silhouette, where is the bird, what habitat. There's a whole set of clues that you combine together that tell you that, if I'm looking up here and I see a bird soaring in the air, it's got a dihedral wing shape, it's probably going to be a turkey vulture. So today I'm at the point where, it's just automatic. It's like kind of, I don't really think, it's just, I see something and
It's like driving a car.
Yeah.
Really. Yeah.
Could you tell me a little bit about what you might know about the fire that happened here in the 60s? It was May of 62. where 400 acres burned for 3 days and threatened houses in Saunders Point, Golden Spur, Laurel Heights. Just tell me a little bit about that, what I just said to you.
So yeah, there was a fire here back in '62 that burned somewhat of 400 acres or so, threatened houses. It was a 3-day fire, so it was a pretty big deal, I think. We weren't here back then. We learned about it once we moved here in 1969. And what we saw when we moved here was a forest, or not really a forest, but it was mainly it had grown up somewhat. So there were a lot of small saplings, pretty low growth, a lot of dead tree snags. You could see the charring on the trunks and stuff. So that's what we saw that was kind of the evidence of the fire and the natural succession that was starting to take place, and which has continued today, obviously.
My input here would be the fire was the cause of, or the number of species that we saw here, and when you add them all up, was largely a product of the fire, because it brought the forest back to a regrowing forest and change in habitat. So it's before the fire, it was a mature regrowth forest after the original settlers cut down all the trees for grazing and everything, and that's why you see all the stone fences within the forest. They were used as agriculture and for grazing. But later on, trees grew up, mainly deciduous trees, and became mature. And then at the fire, those trees were burned down, essentially. So they came up as, instead of one single tree, came up in threes coming out of a single stump, and started out small, except I think a lot of them were preserved in the ravine that we did as our study. I don't think they burned down as much because they were down in there in a lower place and were protected to some extent, I believe.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah,
those trees were taller.
Yeah, we assume that, the fire must have just gone through the crowns of those trees that were in this deep ravine back here upstream of Clark Pond. So that left a different habitat that stayed with much more mature trees.
Right. And our larger birds list talk about all of the hills, not just, when we did our bird study, which we will talk about later, that was the ravine. So that part was changed. But it's mainly regrowth. So we've gone through a lot of forest succession, which changes the birds as the forest grows.
Yeah, so back in the, I guess, 70s and 80s, when we were pretty active here, there were a number of species back then that really aren't found at all today in this area, or in the Oswegatchie Hills. So that's probably caused by a number of factors. Certainly natural succession plays a big role in changing the mix of species that utilize an area. So back when this forest was in the early regrowth stage, there were a lot of birds like blue-winged warblers, prairie warblers, whippoorwill, some of the species that really rely on shrubland habitat were really common here. And gradually over time, these species started to fall away because they depend on these early successional habitats.
Ruffed grouse would be one of those. We had a lot of ruffed grouse, and they like more scrubland.
Right, so ruffed grouse was another species that has disappeared, not only here, but also really throughout the region. Another example of that, a related bird, is the Bobwhite Quail. We used to see that pretty regularly, at least around our house and other places in this area. Today, there are no more Bobwhite Quail in the state of Connecticut. It's believed to be totally, the word they use is extirpated. It's like extinction, but it's at this state level. So there are no more Bobwhite Quail in Connecticut. And that's probably a large function of, again, habitat succession, farmlands being, farmlands falling away and overgrowing, but also development and habitat destruction is also a big factor too.
What's that?
So that bird we're hearing in the background here is a red-bellied woodpecker. And actually the red-bellied woodpecker was pretty rare or not seen at all early on when we were here. It's an example of a bird that was more common in the southern parts of the US, and it's made its way north, probably due to climate change impacts where the environment's gotten warmer. So today it's probably one of the most common woodpeckers around here.